You're listening to Policy Currents, a weekly podcast from RAND. I'm Deanna Lee. It's October 11th. This week marked 1 year since Hamas's October 7th terrorist attacks against Israel. On this grim anniversary, we're bringing you a special episode of Policy Currents that breaks down our researchers' insights into how the complex, decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict has erupted over the last year. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas fighters poured across the Gaza-Israel border in an attack that left 1,200 Israelis dead. In the months that followed, Israel's military response in Gaza has killed more than 41,000 people, including many Palestinian civilians. And in recent weeks, the violence has spilled over into other parts of the Middle East, with Israel launching an offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran conducting airstrikes on Israel. In a new Q&A, RAND experts discussed this ongoing bloody conflict, which many fear is on the brink of becoming a broader regional war. They explain what led to Hamas's October 7th attacks on Israel, the geopolitical fallout of Israel's war in Gaza, current prospects for ending the conflict, and much more. Here's just a sampling of what our researchers had to say. The October 7th attacks dealt a massive blow to Israel's reputation for superb intelligence, to the collective psyche of the Israeli people, and to the credibility of its deterrence strategy, says Brian Michael Jenkins. And now, 1 year later, the war in Gaza has cost Israel support in many segments of American society. In fact, Western attitudes may only harden even more against Israel. Quote, Israel has an American problem that it will struggle to effectively address, Jenkins says. Michel Grisset agrees that the Hamas attacks on Israel and the ensuing Gaza war have tested the U.S.-Israel partnership. The preservation of this relationship remains critical to the security of Israel and to American interests in the broader Middle East, she says. The humanitarian crisis resulting from the war in Gaza has been devastating. There has been tremendous loss of life, displacement of civilians, destruction of infrastructure, widespread food insecurity, and degradation of economies. Given the scale of the destruction, it will take many years, if not decades, for housing, utilities, and other critical infrastructure to be rebuilt, says Shelley Culbertson. And it's because of this massive loss of life and devastation in Gaza that Mark Schwartz, a RAND researcher and former U.S. security coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority, says the United States can and should do more to hold Israel accountable and demand a change in the way it has been targeting Hamas. In an attempt to influence how Israel is prosecuting the ground and air campaign in Gaza, the U.S. is considering imposing and, in select cases, has already imposed conditionality on delivering military aid to Israel. However, Schwartz does not believe that this has been successful. Schwartz also says that he does anticipate a cessation of conventional combat operations in Gaza by early winter of 2025 to the mid-spring. Heather Williams adds that what happens next may depend on actions by Iran, Russia, China, and the United States, and whether these countries take steps to play on events to their own advantage. But what is painfully clear, she says, is that there's no immediate end in sight to the conflict, and Hamas's assault on October 7th will be one of the most pivotal moments shaping the modern Middle East. So why have efforts to end the conflict seemingly gone nowhere? Another RAND expert, Raphael Cohen, tackled this question, writing in the Los Angeles Times late last week. Failure to reach a ceasefire deal has not been for lack of trying on the part of Washington, Cohen says, but U.S. diplomacy and influence have their limits. In fact, U.S. diplomacy has reached these limits many times before in the Middle East. For more than 4 decades, American presidents have tried and failed to broker peace between Israelis and Palestinians. In practice, the United States may have less influence over its allies than one might think. Historically, economic sanctions have a poor track record of forcing major concessions, particularly when existential security matters are at stake, as is the case with Israel right now. And even if U.S. pressure were effective enough to motivate the Israeli government to try to end the war, it still might not succeed. After all, ending the conflict would require the cooperation of both Israel and Hamas, and more specifically, Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who shows no signs of budging. Further, securing a bilateral ceasefire is unlikely to produce a lasting peace, for all the structural and political reasons that have prevented peace in the past. Consider this scenario. A ceasefire deal would require Israel to free hundreds of Hamas militants serving life sentences for murder in exchange for the release of remaining hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. As a result, Hamas's ranks would swell, and eventually the battered terrorist organization would rebuild and strike Israel yet again. Cohen notes that this is all cold comfort to the Palestinians caught in the crossfire, the Israeli hostages who remain in Gaza, and the growing displaced populations of southern Lebanon and northern Israel. But the reality remains. Quote, outside mediators can't end this war, particularly if the combatants themselves don't want to stop fighting. That's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed, check out the show notes at rand.org/podcast. You can also visit rand.org/Israel-Hamas for even more resources on the conflict in the Middle East. We're off next week, but we'll be back in your feeds on October 25th. RAND is a nonprofit institution that helps improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis.